Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director, and joining me here live at the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress is the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to be here with you.
Brandon, it's always a joy to be with you, and especially here at the famous LA Congress.
Now, you're right, it's famous, and you've been coming here for many years. Tell us a little bit about your history with the Congress.
You know, it's funny, on the way down here yesterday, I drove in from Santa Barbara, and it occurred to me that this is the 20th anniversary of my arrival here. I came for the first time in 1997. I'll tell you exactly why I came. I just finished a book on Thomas Aquinas for Crossroad, and the publisher at the time was a guy named Mike Leach, who loved the LA Congress. He said, all right, now to publicize this book, you got to go to the LA Religious Education Congress. And I said, what's the LA Religious Education Congress? I didn't know what it was. He said, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. It's like the biggest event in Catholicism. So I signed up, I remember I left Chicago, and of course there was a blizzard, February in Chicago. So I was delayed. I couldn't land at the John Wayne Airport, which is the one here in Orange County. They diverted me to LAX. I got off the plane. I didn't know where I was, really. Maybe I'd been to LA once before then. And made my way down here. The plane was delayed. I got in like at midnight or 1 o'clock. Got to the hotel, and they didn't have my reservation. So it was like one of those horrific trips. But then the next morning, I'm tired, I'm jet-lagged, I'm disoriented. But I made my way down here, where we are right now, to the convention center, and I just immediately caught the buzz of this place and the excitement of it, and I was sort of hooked from that moment on. I didn't come back every single year, but maybe every other year, so I've been here probably 10 times. And now, to my infinite surprise and to the grace of God, I'm the auxiliary bishop of Los Angeles. Would never have dreamed it when I first arrived here 20 years ago. So I've got a long and happy history with this place.
Now, we're recording this live again from the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress. If you're here, please come visit us. We're at booth 321. We have all sorts of cool stuff. We're giving away free Word on Fire hats. I don't know if you can see that. We also have some great deals on Bishop Barron's books and DVDs. And if you have a question for Bishop Barron, and all of you here watching, if you have a question, we're going to be here for about an hour here. So if you do have a question, step up to the mic, and we'd love to hear from you. Bishop, before we get to the questions, though, I want to ask about your talk. This year, you're speaking this afternoon, actually.
Yeah.
And you're going to be talking on a subject very dear to your heart. Tell us about that.
I'm talking about the problem of the nuns, and I don't mean women religious. I mean the NONES. So the fastest growing religious group in America are those that claim no religious affiliation. And it's especially affecting Catholics. I'll lay out all the statistics during my talk, but it's not a happy situation that we are losing a lot of people, especially among the young. And the surveys will tell us exactly why they're leaving. The young people tell us, here's what's bugging me. Number one, it's an intellectual problem, namely loss of belief in what we're propagating. Many people feel, young people especially, that you can't be rational and reflective and smart and be religious. So I'm going to address a lot of teachers and catechists and evangelists here today and say we got to wake up to this pretty serious problem. And I'll give some suggestions as to how to do that. So there's my little ad for the talk. Come at 3 o'clock if you're here, and I'll lay all that out for you.
Great. So that's at 3 o'clock in the main arena for everybody here. And I'm sure here in a few minutes, maybe we can go a little more in depth into the talk. But we do have a question right now. So welcome. First, what's your name?
My name is Myra Brown.
Hey, Myra. Great to have you here. What's your question for Bishop Barron?
Bishop Barron, you are my intellectual hero and my overall hero, I think. But I know St. Thomas Aquinas is your hero.
Yeah.
What would you ask him if you had a chance to chat with him?
Wow, that's a cool question. Because you're right. He's the main reason that I'm a priest, the main reason that I'm here, that I've gone into teaching and preaching and evangelizing. What would I ask Thomas Aquinas if he were standing right in front of me? I think I'd probably ask him, what do you think is the best strategy for reaching people today who are leaving the faith because of intellectual problems? So Thomas, in his own time, dealt with that problem. I mean, he tried to address these issues intellectually because there was a sort of rising skepticism in his time. I think I'd ask him that. I'd say, Brother Thomas, what should we do now? What's the best way to address the growing number of secularists in our society? What's the strategy you would use today? I think I'd ask him that.
You know, one of
Then
the...
I'd say, how do I become a saint? Please tell me how to become a saint.
I think you really already are.
Oh, gosh, no, I'm not.
Yeah, his sister asked him that, right?
Yeah.
What do I have to do to become a saint? And what did she say?
He said, will it, which I've always loved. His sister said, what must I do to be a saint? And Thomas said, will it. In other words, don't settle for spiritual mediocrity. Desire it. Want it. You know, because God wants us to be saints. He wants all of us to be saints. So we need to want it in return. You know, and then we can cooperate with God's grace. But I always love that answer. Desire it. Too many of us sort of settle for second best when it comes to sanctity.
Good.
You're welcome.
Hey, Bishop, I also would love to hear from you. You wrote an essay titled Thomas Aquinas and Why the New Atheists Are Right.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, good, because it's a very important point. The new atheists say almost to a person, or think almost to a person, that God is a being. God's a being in the universe, and they deny the existence of this being. Well, Thomas would deny that too, because Thomas doesn't think God is a being, but God is a sheer act of to be itself, in and through which all things come to be. Thomas says God is ipsum esse, not en summum, Latin for to be itself rather than a being, see, or the highest being. So in that way, I've argued that Thomas would say to the new atheist, you're right, I agree with you. There is no such thing as this supreme being in and among other beings. And that's a very important point, because often when we disagree about God, we disagree about the basic terms. What do you mean when you say God? And I've said for years that most atheists don't know what we mean when we use the word God.
Hey, next up we have a question from our friend Raphael here. Raphael, welcome. What's your question for Bishop Barron?
Hi, Bishop Barron.
Hi.
So we're from the Diocese of San Bernardino.
Oh, good. Right,
And we're working hard with the Quinto Encuentro.
oh, yeah.
How do you see that happening with the second and third generations of Hispanics?
Yeah.
We know, at least in our diocese, 76% of population of Catholics in our diocese is Hispanic.
Yeah.
A big population, right?
Yep.
1.6 million Catholics in our diocese. 76% are Hispanic.
Yeah.
86% of those are under the age of 25.
Yep.
In the population that you mentioned, right? Second and third generation. How do you see this Quinto Encuentro, if we do it right, focusing in the catechesis, in the leadership of the church in the near future?
Yeah. No,
As of
thank you
now.
for the question. And I've talked about that actually at meetings of the bishops, because I think, in my experience now being out here in LA, and especially in Santa Barbara region, where there are a lot of Hispanics, and I did 40 confirmations last year, half of them were in Spanish. I go up to like the Guadalupe, Santa Maria area, largely Hispanic. I go to Oxnard in my region, largely Hispanic. Here's what I find. If you want to see the faith vibrantly on display, you go into the Hispanic parishes. That's where you've got lots of people. You've got the abuelos and the abuelas, but you've also got the little kids. That's where the faith is energetic. What I've said to the bishops is, I don't think we should look at the Quinto Encuentro primarily as how do we reach out to Hispanics. I would say, how do we encourage Hispanics to evangelize the Anglo community? I think that's where the faith is vibrant. Now, I want Hispanics to feel they've got the summons now to share that faith with an increasingly secularized mainstream culture. What you're hinting at is dead right. What I don't want is that these young Hispanic kids are going to drift into kind of the secularism of our time. Rather, they should claim their vibrant faith and then become missionaries of it. So I was suggesting reverse the momentum. Not like we're reaching out to Hispanics. I want Hispanics reaching out to us, to the mainstream culture, and become themselves evangelizers. That to me is the most important thing.
Great, Bishop. Well, I notice over here in the crowd we have our friends from the Catholic Stuff You Should Know podcast. Guys, why don't you come over here so we can say hi to you real fast.
Great.
Hey, so the Catholic Stuff You Should Know podcast is one of the best Catholic podcasts out there. If you're not already subscribed, go look it up on iTunes. Guys, maybe we can have a little chat here about podcasting. You tell us how you guys got started and a little bit about your show.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're huge fans, honestly, just to make sure like it's public record. We actually believe in Word on Fire. There was some discrepancy over whether or not we were supporting you. I will say in front of everyone, you should probably be listening to Word on Fire instead of our show.
Let it be written.
Let it be written.
Scriptio,
Good.
scripsies.
Well, how did you guys get into the whole podcasting? You're priests.
Sure.
I mean, most priests, podcasting's nowhere on their radar. So
Right.
how did you guys get started?
Well, two priests, two seminarians from our seminary in Denver heard the call from Pope Benedict in 2010 to just use new forms of communication to reach the masses. And there was this new kind of form like podcasts, and they started in the basement with like an old gateway computer. Just recording for 7 minutes because then the computer would shut down, and they just started doing it, and eventually more people started listening, and so that was Father John and Father Mike, and then Father Mike actually got sent to Rome, and then they were looking for somebody else to fill in, and I got chosen, and then one of our other brothers left, and Father Michael, who's a Byzantine priest, came on, so we just turn the mics on and see what happens. So probably a little more sobriety in your podcast. We try to pregame.
We're pro-sobriety here at Word on Fire.
Yeah, I guess we are too. We usually start with just a little bit of bourbon and just a little bit of preparation, and just see what happens.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful conversation.
Now, I love seeing the young priests using the new media. You
Yep.
were rector at Mundelein Seminary. Was that something that you told the young guys coming up through the seminary that they
Yeah.
need to focus on?
I said, people like me who learned to type on a manual typewriter, which tells you how old I am. I said, you guys have the new media in your fingers, and it's in your blood. You grew up with it. I had to kind of learn it, third hand. So yes, I would encourage them, take what the culture's given you and now use it for the gospel. And we all know anybody under 40, let's say, is geared much more to the world of video and new media. And so we can't be just writing learned articles. I'm all in favor of learned articles. They're great. But you want to reach the next generation, the rising generation,
Yes.
you got to use all these different media. So yeah, that was a big message of mine to the young guys at Mundelein.
Well, good. Well, thanks, guys. It was good seeing you.
Yeah, God bless you.
Do you want to say anything, Mike?
I was just going to say one of the recipes I think for success for us has been absolutely we're using to share what we already do.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're a bishop and you're preaching, you're teaching as you should as a bishop.
Yeah.
And then with us, we're friends, and we record what we normally would be talking about, and it's become incredibly popular, and people love it because of the friendship, because of the banter, because of the topics, and it really is utilizing the new media as a side to the normal friendship and teaching that happens. It's not the main point, of course, but we turn the mics on and then we talk and then we send it out to the world, and the Spirit does the rest.
And that's the thing, too, about sending it out to the world. We, again, have media that Fulton Sheen would have given his right arm to have, right? That we can get a message out literally all over the world like that, and YouTube or these podcasts and so on. So that's, to me, the way the Holy Spirit's working in all this.
Amen.
Can we ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah.
What's your question?
We're gonna tee one up for you, Bishop.
Okay.
You mentioned learned articles, and especially some of the theologians from the early 20th century, like Hans Urs von Balthasar, have been extremely formative for you as well as for us.
Yeah.
But he can be a thinker that a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with or aren't accustomed to because of his way of writing or whatever. If you could distill maybe one or two ideas that you would want people to discover in Hans Urs von Balthasar, what would you recommend?
Well, I would start with, the Mysterium Pascale, which is the first book of his that I read, and just to talk about the journey of the Son of God into God-forsakenness. So the drama, the theodrama of the Father sending his Son all the way to the limits of God-forsakenness to bring the sinful world back is a very compelling way to explain what the cross and redemption are about. The second thing I would talk about is beauty. Beauty is a route of access to God. So Balthasar, who was a more aesthetically minded person, certainly brilliant, but he wasn't trained so much in philosophy as in, linguistics and the arts, literature, And I think that's the path he found, which I do think I've often argued is the more winsome path today, when people get so defensive around ideas and the ideational approach. He proposed an artistic approach. And I think that's something we can really learn from him. So Mysterium Pascale, the theodrama, and Beginning with Beauty are two great things in Balthasar.
Amen. Well, God bless you.
All right.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
God bless you guys. And to all everyone watching this, listening on the podcast, check out the Catholic Stuff You Should Know podcast. They're good guys. We love them. So be sure you subscribe too. Once again, we're here at the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress. I'm Brandon Vaught. I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. We're at booth 321. So if you're in the Congress, come by and stop and say hi and ask some questions of us. 321. We also have some really cool deals on our books and our DVDs, and we're giving away these really cool free hats. They're totally free, so stop by and get your Word on Fire hat today. Hey, Bishop, let's talk a little more about your talk coming up here in a few hours.
Yeah.
You're speaking on catechesis and evangelization, which is a perfect fit for you, especially since you were just elected the chairman of the USCCB's, the Bishops' Committee or Council on Evangelization and Catechesis. Maybe give us some brief bullet points of your vision of where the church in America needs to move in these areas.
Well, what I'll talk about today is, given the fact that young people are telling us that the main reason they're leaving is they're losing faith in what the church holds. They're objecting to the church as, unscientific, as simply a wish-fulfilling fantasy, and being very involved in violence. That's what we hear from young people. So it's an intellectual task we have to make the faith more compelling. So I'm going to talk about some of the arguments for God's existence. And if people say, oh, that's getting too abstract, I'm going to say, absolutely not. Look at the new atheists. And Brandon, you've been on this theme for a while. That look at the Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris. They did not hug these young people into atheism. They argued them into atheism or unbelief. I deal with younger people all the time on the YouTube page and all this, and you hear the arguments of Hitchens, Dawkins, Sam Harris. We need to out-argue our opponents. We can't simply rely on, good feelings and being inviting and having good music, as important as all that is. We need to argue the kids and the young people back. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to talk about this whole problem of religion and violence, which has been revived by September 11th. And the new atheists, of course, took advantage of that. A lot of the new atheist movement came in the wake of 9/11. So I'm going to talk about what's the right way to see religion in relation to violence, and a number of other things, too, I'll develop in the talk today.
One thing I hear often is you can't argue people into the faith. But what I found is that good arguments for Christianity are needed in order to create an atmosphere where Christianity is intellectually respectable. Is
That's
that what
right.
you found?
Yes, and see, sometimes there are simply blocks to the faith that have been put up because people have intellectual disagreements. And until we can knock those out of the way, we can't open the door, to the faith. And so, yes, in the strict sense, you can't, propose an argument that will simply solve the whole issue. Of course not. But we got to deal with that problem because the routes of access to the faith are blocked for many people. And so that's an important ministry we have to do.
Let's talk a little bit about one of the objections that you just mentioned. I know this is a big problem, especially for a lot of young people, the religion and violence objection. So if you read the atheist books, heck, if you even just watch TV, you'll see this insinuated that religion is primarily about forcing your will on others, and that the only way to adjudicate disputes is through violent conflict. Where do we begin to show that violence is not at the heart of Christianity?
Well, the best place to start, of course, is the cross of Jesus, which is the central point of all of Revelation. And we should read the entire Bible from the standpoint of the cross of Jesus, this great moment of God's nonviolent love for the violent world. So I'd start there. I'd also, though, draw attention, and I'll do it in the talk, to the fact that the view that you've rightly presented as a common one goes back really to the Enlightenment of the 18th century, when the enemies of religion tried to associate religion with violence in just that way, to say, well, it's irrational, therefore the only way to adjudicate disputes among religious people is through violence. Well, that became part of the sort of common consensus, and you see it revived very much by the post-9/11 new atheists. It's like, there it is. There is religion again on display. It's irrational, therefore violent. I'm going to make a lot of arguments today that an objective survey of the situation will show that, comparatively speaking, very little of the world's violence over the centuries can be placed at the doorstep of religion. So it's a prejudice born of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. I'll also look at some of the things in the Bible of how to read the text of the Bible that seem to be advocating
Talk
violence.
about that. Let's go a little more into that. Like, how would you read, say, in the Old Testament where God orders the ban to be put on people? That means he's going to wipe out an entire population. How do you read that as a faithful Catholic?
First move, read the entire Bible from the standpoint of the cross of Jesus. So he's the one that opens the seals in the book of Revelation. It's the Lamb standing as though slain that opens the seals, meaning he's the standpoint from which the whole of the Bible should be read. Therefore, if you read any part of the Bible and come to the conclusion that God is advocating violence, then you've misread the Bible, ipso facto. And that's not some little private opinion of mine. That's the view of Origen from the 3rd century. It's a very ancient interpretive key. Once you see that, now we can read those texts in a more spiritualized way about the great struggle against evil in the world and how it must be done all the way down. You know, certain forms of evil have to be resisted all the way down. So I'll talk a bit about that in the presentation today too.
In the past, you've given the example of cancer. If you went to a doctor and the doctor said, well, we're going to try to get rid of most of the cancer and dabble around with it, you would be totally unsatisfied.
Right, we got 95% of it. Who'd be happy with that? You know, so certain forms of evil have to be resisted all the way down. And what we do, and go back to that famous story of Saul and the Amalekites, is we tend to play around with evil. We deal with it kind of. We deal with it, but we keep a little bit for ourselves, you know. So the story, I think, rightly read, is about the way to engage evil.
Well, once again, we're here live at the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, one of the biggest Catholic conferences certainly in America, maybe the world. There's thousands and thousands of people here. We're so glad to see everyone. There's lots of people here around our booth. Just a quick shout-out reminder, if you guys have any questions for Bishop Barron, we'd love to hear them. Just head over here to the line and jot down your question. And we'd love to hear from you. Also, if you're watching this live on Facebook, we'd love to hear from you as well. In fact, we have a question from Gina on Facebook, Bishop. She's wondering this. Okay. You've done the Catholicism series. You've done the Pivotal Players, which is your big follow-up. What's next?
Well, it's finishing up the Pivotal Players. So we had done 6 of them, and then I was named a bishop. And so that messed the whole thing up, you know, because I was sent out here.
Pope Francis, you know.
Pope Francis, didn't he know I was in the middle of filming the Pivotal Players? So I had to spend a year kind of getting myself established out here. Well, now that I am, we've decided to keep pressing forward. But see, the issue was, do we wait until we do all 12 and then not bring it out for another, 3 years, or do we finish what we started? So we decided to publish the 6 that we had, and now I'll continue filming the remaining 6. So that's the next really big film project I've got.
And let's talk about some of those. I know there's maybe of the next 6, there's still maybe a little hesitancy about who a couple of them are, but tell us who we definitely are going to film.
Yeah, I've got 4 scripts that are all finished, and we're in the process of getting those things ready. St. Benedict, who I think arguably is the most pivotal figure in all of church history. Think of the monastic movement from which the renewal of civilization came. So Benedict is one of them. Also St. Augustine, who is one of my great heroes and one of the most significant players in all of Western culture. Also Ignatius of Loyola, someone very dear to our present Holy Father and someone of hugely pivotal significance in the life of the Church. Who's our 4th one that we got done? We have Benedict, we've got Augustine, we've got Ignatius, and Bartolome de las Casas,
right,
who represents the very best, I think, of the Church's human rights tradition. In many ways, the modern sense of human rights comes from people like Las Casas. So we have those 4 done, and 2 that we're debating a little bit.
Yeah, we won't spill those beans yet.
Not yet.
It'll be exciting when we do. Hey, listen, we have another question. This
Good.
One comes from our friend Hope. Hope, welcome,
Please.
and what's your question for Bishop Barron?
Hi, thanks. So I was wondering, should we approach sin like it says in the scripture, if your arm causes you to sin, cut it off, as a zero-sum game of sin versus holiness? Or should we expect our weaknesses and brokenness and not be surprised by them?
Yeah, good. And of course, you're referring to Jesus' famous, exhortation, which I think is typical of the linguistic style of his time, where he stressed things in this sort of over-the-top way to make the point. But to get to your point, I think it's a good one. Sin is irreconcilable with holiness. Therefore, sin has got to be eradicated. We don't play around with sin. We don't make compromise with it. We don't say, well, I've kind of gotten it together, but I still have this little bit that is okay. No, sin should be opposed all the way down, you know. So there's the kind of objective theological side, but you're also hitting correctly, I think, the psychological side, which is kind of a certain understanding with ourselves that we're not going to become spiritual heroes and athletes overnight. I remember I used to say to my students at Mundelein back in the John Paul II era, and here's this great saint, this great, indeed, heroic figure. And I said, one of the shadow sides of the John Paul II generation is sometimes they didn't know what to do when they failed, as we all do. We're all sinners. And so, the answer in the church, of course, is go to confession, seek good spiritual direction, find a spiritual mentor, get up and get back in the arena and try again, But to have a little, I think, understanding with yourself psychologically that I'm not going to become John Paul II or the Kyrie of Ars overnight. So I think that's a legitimate perspective on it. But it should not bleed into a sort of indifferentism about sin, as though, I can handle a little bit of sin. God wants us, what did Jesus say? Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So not settle for spiritual mediocrity, but also have a little understanding with yourself and the difficulty of the spiritual life. That's probably the closest to the right answer.
Thanks, Hope.
Thanks.
That calls to mind something you've spoken and written about pretty often before as well, that the church holds out extreme demands.
Yeah.
It demands a lot. It demands perfection. But it's balanced by an extreme mercy.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
See, and I get that from our mutual friend G.K. Chesterton, right, who says the church is not either or, it's not a bland middle ground, but it's kind of the two extremes both waving their flag, the extreme of moral demand. Yes, we're called to be saints, great saints, not mediocrities. So wave that flag. At the same time, the church is extravagant in its mercy. So if you're the most hardened sinner in the world, but you come back to Christ in a spirit of contrition, seeking forgiveness, you'll be forgiven for anything and everything. The church is extravagant in its demand, and it's extravagant in its mercy at the same time. The trouble is one or the other, or a bland compromise. See, it's a plague on all three of those houses. Give me Chesterton's both flags waving. That's Catholicism.
When I converted to Catholicism, one of the things I heard most often from people who were so confused by my conversion was they would say, how do you deal with all that Catholic guilt? The Catholic Church is always trying to make you feel guilty about whatever behaviors you're involved in. But that was never my experience. It was always just the opposite. I thought, it's the answer to all this guilt, the mercy the church offers.
To be honest with you, so, I'm of a certain age. I came of age after Vatican II. When I hear about Catholic guilt, I just sort of smile. That was not my experience, trust me, growing up. When I was growing up, the stress was hugely on the love and mercy of God. Hugely so. In fact, I think my generation needed to get a little more Catholic guilt, honestly. Now, I get it. My parents' generation, they got a healthy dose of Catholic guilt, probably too much. The idea is both and. But trust me, my generation, if we're honest, we sort of smile when people talk about Catholic guilt. We didn't get a lot of Catholic guilt. We got the opposite. I think we needed a little more sense of the moral demand. At its best, the Catholic tradition does this great both and that's what we need.
Well, again, we're here live at the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress. I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. We're at the Word on Fire booth. If you're here, come see us, number 321. Next up, we have a question from our friend Anthony, who's got a great question about prayer. So, Anthony, what's your question for Bishop Barron?
Hi, Bishop.
Hi.
I'm seminarian, and I've been a fan of yours for quite some time.
Excellent.
One question, what is the difference between meditative prayer and contemplative prayer?
Well, it depends on what school you're in and how the terms are being used. I mean, people talk about mental prayer, which is kind of a use of the imagination and so on. When you read the real high mystics on contemplation, so read your Teresa of Avila's and your John of the Crosses and Thomas Merton's, they'll talk about a type of prayer that really goes beyond any sort of image or concept or idea. And I think contemplation in its pure sense is that deep, intense union with God that's beyond all of that. Where meditation or discursive prayer or mental prayer, you might say, is using imagination, all that. Now, my approach is all of the above. I think I always balk a little bit when we talk about stages and levels and all that, and what stage you're at. Because I'm with John Paul II, who said, the older I get, the more I'm convinced that petitionary prayer is the highest form of prayer. That when you say, oh God, help me, that's the highest prayer there is. You know what I mean? And to look down on that, I moved beyond that. Now I'm into discursive prayer, and now I'm going to go into contemplation. Okay, I mean, I get it, and there are all these different levels, but I think the essence of prayer, raising the mind and heart to God, communion with God, no matter what form that takes. If your imagination works for you, off you go. Ignatian prayer and all that. If high contemplation works for you, great, off you go. If the simplest petitionary prayer brings you close to God, off you go. You know. Do you know the book by what's his name? The Dominican, the great Dominican. I can't think of it now. But called The Way of Imperfection. I've always loved that because not the way of perfection. You know, I'm going to climb the ladder to this perfect. He likes the way of imperfection. You know, when we're kind of stumbling along. Merton's prayer. You know, my Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. That's not a bad prayer. You know. So I guess that's a quick answer to a really complex question you're raising.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks for that.
Piggybacking on that, let me ask a much simpler question. Suppose someone's watching this on Facebook, they're here around us, and they just want some practical advice on how to pray better. Maybe I find it difficult. Maybe I just haven't gotten to a routine. What would you recommend?
I do Merton's line first, take the time. So take the time every day, just like exercise. Oh, I don't exercise enough. Well, the first move is take the time, no matter what you do. Maybe it's walking around the backyard, but take the time. So same with prayer. What's the best time of day for you? For me, I know it's the morning. I do my holy hour in the morning. Some people, it's the end of the day. You know, the end of the long day, they can pray before going to sleep. Take the time is the first thing. And then I'd say, find a simple form of prayer that speaks to you. Is it the rosary? Is it a decade of the rosary? Is it one of my favorites, the Jesus prayer, right? Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Simply repeat it over and over again. Maybe it's that prayer of contemplation, of silence. Maybe it's the car. I think the car can be a very good locale for prayer. You're alone, typically. You're in this kind of enclosed monastic space. Pray in the car. So I'd take the time, begin with something simple, and realize that prayer is a conversation with God. And start from there.
Very good. Now, again, we're broadcasting this on Facebook Live, so if you're watching this on Facebook, please post your questions there. We have a good question from a man named Dan Raminger. Now, this one's going to ratchet up the sophistication level
All
here,
right,
Bishop.
let's go.
So here's the heavy hitter theological questions. All right, here's what Dan is wondering. You've said often, citing Thomas Aquinas, that God doesn't fit in any genus.
Yeah.
But if that's true, Dan says, how is God three persons? How can God be a person if he's not in a genus?
Well, because when you say God is three persons, you don't mean that he's in the genus of person.
That he's a
as
type
though,
of person.
Like you and I are persons, and then Jared's a person, and God's a person. You don't mean it that way. A person, as Thomas used the term there, so persona, is a subsistent relation, which doesn't compromise the simplicity of the divine essence. So it's not in competition at all with God's simplicity, and it's God's simplicity that means he's beyond any genus. Because see, the minute you put something in a genus, what you've done is you've made an ontological distinction. You've rendered that being in a certain way complex. So like you and I, for example, are human beings. We're not the sheer active to be. We're the active to be, but in a particular form. We're in that way more complex than God. So to say that God is three persons, that means there are three subsistent relations within the unity of the divine essence, and that essence is the very active to be, which means it's outside of any generic specification. So that's the answer to that one. One of the most ingenious moves that Aquinas made is to show that we can go by certain logical steps from the divine simplicity to the tri-personality of God. And I'll walk you through that if we have time someday in a lecture. But no, so that wouldn't compromise God's simplicity that he has three persons.
You know, I remember reading Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and one of his main arguments against God was this idea that if the universe is so incredibly complex, and he granted that, you know, our universe is mind-bogglingly complex, then it had to be designed by somebody, if it was designed by a designer, that was more complex than the universe. And so when he hears Christians like us say that God is simple, he thinks, well, then God couldn't have created all of this complexity in our world. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's just equivocating on the terms there of simplicity and complexity. What I would say is that an intelligent reality is responsible for the intelligibility of the cosmos. I think that's a legitimate move. But when you say that God is simple, you mean that God is the sheer active to be itself. What we see as the complexity of the universe would be like white light that passes through a prism and then breaks into a variety of colors. So what you see in the world would be the divine simplicity refracted and reflected, if you want, in this incredible diversity and variety. But see, God is a higher reality because God is more simple in his ontological makeup. So we're equivocating on the terms there, which the new atheists do all the time, by the way. I would say a higher intelligence is responsible for the intelligibility, but a more pure simplicity is the ground of the multivalence and complexity of the universe, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Now let's hop back to your talk that you're going to give here in a few hours. We're at the Los Angeles Education Religious Congress. Bishop Barron's going to speak to everyone here in the main arena in a few hours on the tasks of catechesis and evangelization, what we need to do to form and shape young people specifically and introduce them to an encounter with Jesus Christ. One of the blocks, we talked about the violence one earlier, one of the main blocks is this presumption that science somehow contradicts faith, that it's somehow in conflict with religious belief. Now, we've done podcasts, you've written a lot of articles and stuff on this. At a higher level, what would you recommend to a lot of the teachers, religious educators here who are dealing with, young kids, 7 to 12 years old? How do we begin to undermine that idea early?
I'll tell you, one thing I'm going to suggest, I've done it before, is all the science teachers in our Catholic school should begin by getting the biggest photograph they can find of Georges Lemaitre, who is the formulator of the Big Bang theory of cosmic origins, which everyone accepts today. He was so smart that he had to convince Einstein that it was correct. Einstein didn't think it was correct. Well, who was Georges Lemaitre? He was a Belgian priest. And when you find photos of him, he's always wearing this big old Roman collar.
Yeah.
I would suggest get the biggest picture you can find, frame it, put it up in your science classroom, because you're right, the number one reason our young people tell us they're leaving is that science refutes religion. Our first counter argument is Georges Lemaitre.
Nobody told him that.
No one told Georges Lemaitre that. And also, I was out in my pastoral region the other day at Villanova High School, which has an Augustinian tradition. I love the fact that in their science area, I saw this big photograph of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel, Augustinian friar and founder of modern genetics. Don't tell me that science and religion are incompatible. So that's an opening move I'd make. Now, there's much more to be said, and I'll say a few more things in the talk today. One, though, I think would be this, that in fact, theology in a way is the ground of science. All science rests upon the fundamental assumption that being, as we encounter it in the world, is intelligible.
What do you mean by that? Let's pause there. What does it mean to be
understandable? That it has some kind of rational structure that beguiles an inquiring mind. So think of any scientist, engineer, you're a scientist, engineer, or a biologist, or a chemist, a physicist. Any scientist will go out to meet a world that has intelligibility. Well, we take that so for granted, we don't think how strange that is. Where does the intelligibility of the world come from? Well, I think the only way finally to understand it adequately is to say it comes from an intelligence that gave rise to it. I would argue that the modern physical sciences emerged where and when they did because they came up out of a religious or theological matrix where people believed in the Creator God who made all things through his logos. I think once those connections are made and the kids can say, take a deep breath, relax, and say, oh yeah, sure. In fact, the scientists grow up out of a religious matrix, But I'll say a few more things about it during the talk.
I like that strategy because it's a historical fact.
Yeah.
I mean, even non-religious scientists will recognize that it was only out of the Christian culture that science arose. It didn't come out of the East. It didn't come from the Greeks. It only came from the Christian West. And so why is that?
And let's be curious about it. Let's really ask that question. How come? Why did it rise where and when it did? It's not an accident. And then also, look at so many of the founders of the sciences were not, accidentally religious. They were devoutly religious people. Whether you're looking at Descartes or at Newton or at Copernicus, et cetera, we're so beguiled by the myth of Galileo that we see that as the all-determining story, when in fact it's a much, much more complex story. And in fact, most of the founders of the modern sciences were devoutly religious. It's, again, I would argue, an invention of the Enlightenment and the period after the Enlightenment to set up this great war between science and religion. Sadly, it's crept down into the minds of our young people. It's come through a lot of their teachers, and I am going after teachers in some of the secular institutions that have perpetuated this myth of the war between science and religion. We need to fight that because it's compromising a lot of our young people.
Probably the fundamental idea at the root of this myth is the term that you've described as scientism.
Yeah.
This idea that the only knowable truth is what can be proved through this scientific method. How do we begin to show our kids and our adults that there's more to the world than what the sciences can prove?
Yeah, a first move is to show that scientism is logically incoherent, because the one thing you can't do through the scientific method, strictly speaking, is prove that all knowledge is reducible to the scientific form of knowledge. So it's an incoherent position. It rests upon a completely illogical foundation.
So you could say, is scientism true? And if they say yes, you can say, well, how does science
Now demonstrate
prove
that to me through observation, experimentation, hypothesis formation, and so on. You can't do it. Here's the other thing, and I'll go back to my mentor, Cardinal George, is he said the loss of philosophy has been a huge problem in this regard, because we don't see that there are other ways of knowing truth besides the scientific form. That philosophy speaks truth. That Hamlet, for example, speaks something true. Hamlet's not just beautiful, it's not just interesting and diverting, it's true. That Dante speaks certain truth. I think our kids have lost a sense of the humanities as bearers of the truth. So they see it's only science that bears truth. Therefore, if it's not scientific, it must be fantasy or must be, superstition or something. No, we need to recover non-scientific avenues of truth, and then religion fits in that.
I think the false leap is whenever people recognize science has produced great, undeniable results, therefore nothing else can. It's that therefore that's the problem.
Yeah, right. And I'm not for a moment denigrating the sciences.
Right.
I love the sciences, and they have indeed, through their technology, proven extremely efficacious. But let's not reduce things to simply the sciences. Because, what are you looking for when you say a form of knowledge produces something? Well, yes, technology, thank God, but poetry produces something too. Philosophy has produced something as well. Virtue being one of them, for example. So anyway, we got to recover other forms of knowing.
Well, hey, again, we're at the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress. We're taking questions from you on Facebook Live and also from all of our friends here in attendance. Next up, we have a question from our friend Joe, who's piggybacking on what we've just been discussing here. Joe's got a question about Genesis, the Big Bang, and the beginning of creation. So, Joe, what's your question for Bishop?
Please.
Father Barron, it's nice to see you.
Thanks.
I've watched your videos and studied your videos extensively, and you have a very positive view of how science and religion tie together. I was also intrigued on you bringing up the Big Bang and the age of the universe being several billion years old. How does the 6 days of creation fit into that timeline?
Yeah, because I wouldn't see them as competing with each other. So the Genesis story is not proposing alternative science. It's not a scientific account. It's a theological account. If I'm looking for the age of the cosmos, I'm not going to consult the book of Genesis. I'll consult the scientists. Genesis is speaking extremely powerful, irreducibly important theological truths, but it's not itself a scientific text. So I wouldn't put them in competition with each other, as though we have to make a decision, now, do I go with Genesis or with the Big Bang? They're qualitatively different types of literature. And both are great and both are needed, but I wouldn't put them in tension with each other.
Thanks. Now, one of the things you've written about, specifically in regards to Genesis, is that the Bible is not a single book that needs to be read in a single way, that it's a collection of books with varying genres. Talk about the different ways that we need to read the Bible.
Yeah, and that's from Vatican II, and then a lot of the people that produced Vatican II were insistent upon this, that genre sensitivity is key to biblical hermeneutics. A fancy way of saying, to interpret the Bible right, you got to know what kind of book you're dealing with, right? So the Bible, I often said, is not a book, it's a library, it's a collection of books from a wide variety of times, places, authors, intended audiences, etc. It has in it poetry, it has saga, it has legend, it has history, it has letters, it has apocalypse, it has gospels. All those are different literary forms, and we have to know what kind of form we're dealing with as we interpret it. So if you put, let's say Ellman's famous biography of James Joyce in front of me, the first move I got to make in reading that book is knowing, that's a biography. That's in the genre of biography. Someone puts a novel in front of me. Well, I'm not going to mistake that for a history book, right? The first move I got to make is say, what is this book? What kind of book is this? Someone puts a history book, I'm not going to treat it like a novel, etc. Someone puts the 4 quartets of T.S. Eliot in front of me. Well, what is that? That's a poem. That's a poem of a particular type. That's the first move to make in hermeneutics. And so with the Bible, the trouble is they're all collected between 2 covers. And so I say, well, this is one book. No, it's a collection of books. And so I've got to be very sensitive to genre. Otherwise, we'll just get off on the wrong foot. And that's Vatican II. Look at Dei Verbum, the statement on the Bible and on biblical interpretation. That's one of the first and most important points it makes, is genre sensitivity.
Do you think, especially among young people, again, you're going to be giving a talk here in a few hours on catechizing, evangelizing young people. Do you think the Bible is a sticking point for many young people? Are they biblically illiterate? And what do we do about that?
Oh, man, there's another talk I could give if I had time to put it together. Is, Vatican II called for a revival of the Bible. And I've just been convinced for a long time it's never happened. We've made efforts, but the real kind of re-embracing of the Bible that Vatican II called for has not happened. I think people get stuck right away on some of these religion science issues. They get stuck on biblical literalism stuff. They overlook the kind of genre sensitivity matters. But also, I think we've, as a culture, lost a sense of the Bible. Read 19th century politicians, writers like a Melville or a Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read the speeches of Abraham Lincoln. What were they all assuming? That everyone knew the Bible, that everyone knew the great stories and narratives of the Bible. I'm just afraid that's largely been lost. And here's a little, as you know, a little cri de coeur of mine. I know kids, I mean like 8, 9-year-old kids, that can recite the entire Star Wars narrative in all its detail. Every character, every little plot twist. Don't tell me kids can't understand the Bible. Don't tell me, oh, that's way too complicated, oh, all these big names. They can handle Obi-Wan Kenobi fine, so they can handle Melchizedek. You know what I'm saying? And so I think we've not drawn our young people sufficiently into the world of the Bible, and in some ways the culture's provided certain sticking points there that have made that problematic. The Bible's it. The Bible's it. That's what Vatican II wanted. The liturgy is all the Bible. The church is moving into a biblical space, So anyway, that's the end of my rant on that. But I think we've missed the boat largely on the Bible.
I want to make sure you get some rest before your talk, so maybe we'll take a couple more questions here, and then we'll wrap it up. Once again, this is the Word on Fire show. We're recording live from the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress. We're so happy to see all of our friends and followers here around our booth. Next up, we have a question from Facebook, so all of you watching here. This one comes from Ryan Cooley. And Bishop, he's wondering, what do you think is the best way to invite a Catholic who is inactive to come back to the Catholic Church? What would you say to that?
I would say your own personal invitation. Don't wait for someone else to do it. Don't assume that, the priest will take care of that. You do it. You invite your friend to come with you to Mass, or come with you to Bible study, or come with you to the youth group, or whatever it is. You personally, don't wait for someone else to do it. You personally invite them, and then come with them. And then you have a chance to talk about it afterwards. Hey, what struck you? Did you like it? Why not? So I would say that is you personally get some skin in the game, And we are, this again, Vatican II, which, don't get me started, I think largely unrealized, a lot of the goals of Vatican II. But one of them is the priesthood of all believers, the universal call to holiness. We put a lot of stress on the rights and privileges of the laity. I'd say also the responsibility of the laity. If you're a priest, prophet, king, that's not just a privilege, that's a responsibility. You're meant to sanctify the world, priest. You're meant to proclaim, you're a prophet, and you're meant to guide people. See what do kings do? They guide people. Well, get a friend of yours and say, come on, we're going to Mass. Come on, we're going to the Bible study. You be priest, prophet, and king, not just a privilege, it's a responsibility.
Let's close here with one more question. In a few hours, you're going to be speaking to thousands of people about catechesis, evangelization. I don't think it's any secret that we're in a crisis point when it comes to those two things. The statistics are incredibly heartbreaking. If you could say one thing to everybody here in regards to what we need to do in evangelization and catechesis, what would you say?
Well, I think I just said it. I think I would say you take personal responsibility. Yes, we have a crisis. Come to the talk and I'll lay out all the stats. One of them, for every one person that joins the church, was at 6.4 are leaving. So if you're running a business and someone told you for every one customer we're getting, we're losing 6, you'd have a couple meetings about that. You'd have a couple conversations.
And maybe a little more than a meeting.
About what do we do about this crisis, So it's not just the priest's problem or the bishop's problem. It is our problem, but it's everyone's problem. It's the whole people of God need to say, we got to pick up our game. And I think personal invitation, personal witness is indispensable. Every single Catholic Roman around here knows a nun. I don't mean a woman religious. I mean, maybe they know nuns too, but they know an N-O-N-E, right? Someone, I know a lot of them, people in my family.
What do you mean by that, nun?
Someone who says, I have no religion, right? No religious affiliation. Okay, go get them. Go get them. And we'll try to provide, tools and some of the insight, but it's up to people on the ground, I think, to be evangelizers, to be priests, prophets, and kings. So off you go. Do it.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Word on Fire show, especially to all our friends on Facebook, hundreds of people from all over the world. We're glad to see you. Thank you to everybody here listening to us. I want to point out that right now, after the show, we have a couple special deals for Bishop Barron's DVDs and books, so make sure to take advantage of those. Also, you can find out more about this show by visiting the website wordonfireshow.com. That's where you'll find this episode and all the past episodes as well. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see everybody next week on the Word on Fire show.